Hey homesteaders, gardeners, and cooks. My name is Jennifer. Welcome to Miles Away Farm, or welcome back. I am going out to check the greenhouse because we had a very cold night last night. We got down to 27, and I thought this would be a good time to talk about a 4-part series that I've wanted to do. So I got a little ahead of myself when I was making this video. And if you are a brand new gardener, one of the things that a lot of new gardeners don't realize is that there are cold season or cool season plants, and there are warm season plants. And a cold season plant is a plant that can take a frost. And that doesn't mean that they can survive a 12-degree Fahrenheit night, but they can take 28 degrees, getting a little frost on them, and recover. A warm season plant will absolutely die as soon as it freezes. And interestingly, the difference is actually these plants basically have kind of an antifreeze in their leaves themselves. And so they're able to freeze and then thaw and survive without all their cells rupturing when those water molecules freeze. And the warm season plants cannot do that. And so the very first thing you need to know is, am I planting something that is a cool season plant, or am I planting something that is a warm season plant? And most of the photos that I've been showing behind this chart as I've been talking are warm season plants. Let's go check the greenhouse, see how things are looking. We're going to start outside. And so I see a lot of new gardeners this time of year who are really struggling with their plants not thriving. As an aside, these are all cool season plants that can take a frost, but I covered them anyway just because I didn't want to shock the heck out of them. And they need some water, so I'm going to get out here and do a little watering. You can see this guy's looking just slightly floppy, and that's mostly from the weight of the blanket on them. But we gave them a cover just to help them through. But yeah, I see a lot of people that are having issues with their plants not thriving, and they don't know why. And so they'll post a picture on a social media group and they'll just say, why is this happening? And I wanted to give you a checklist of things to think about if you've got something that isn't doing what you think it should be doing. And so if you've followed me at all for any length of time, you know that I love the book Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat, which is a cookbook. And the idea of that book is, if you've got made a dish and it's not quite what you thought it was going to be, and it isn't really hitting, that one of the things you can do is ask yourself, does it need a little bit more salt? Does it need a hit of acid? Does it need a little bit more richness with some fat? Or does it need a little bit of zip with some spice? I have a very similar list when it comes to why aren't my seedlings thriving. And that list is moisture, temperature, light, and soil. So even though it got down to 27 last night outside, we had the heaters and the heat mats going in here, and our low is right here. You need to read it on the right side. So our low was 43. So we did okay considering how cold it got. If I didn't have any supplemental heat in here, it probably would have been about 33. We usually are about 5 degrees above. So since I'm out here in the greenhouse, I'm going to water some things, but I'm going to talk to you about temperature and how important temperature is for seed starting and for plants to thrive. I really think it's one of the most neglected parts of beginning gardening is how important soil temperature is. And you can download charts of what optimal soil temperature is for plants, and it varies depending on the particular plant. And generally seeds need a higher temperature to germinate than they do to grow. And so that's part of why once you get your pepper seedlings sprouted, they will grow fairly well at a lower temperature. So I like to start my pepper seeds at 75 to 80 degrees. And then after that, if I'm at room temperature, they're fine. But they need that extra heat to grow. Soil temperature is really important as you plant things out as well. People spend a lot of time trying to make sure that they got a jump on the season, they're growing things as early as possible, getting stuff out as early as possible because they think that's going to make all the difference. And the reality is the soil hasn't warmed up yet, and you plant things out and they basically, I always say that they just give you the finger for the first couple of weeks because it's just too cold and they're not ready, and they will just sit there and they're fine, they don't die, but they're not growing actively either. And the problem with that is the longer a plant just sits and isn't actively growing, the more time for diseases to get a hold of it, for insects to get in there and start chewing on it. And so, like, I've planted, there's an old phenology thing about planting peas when the forsythia blooms. Around here, forsythia blooms about the second week in March. And I have, on several occasions, planted my peas on the 15th of March and not had them even germinate until April, usually the second week in April. So it got me nowhere. It did nothing for me because the soil was simply too cold. There is a great website, and I don't love this company. They're similar to Monsanto, but they have a really good website that helps calculate what your soil temperature is based on your weather. And so you can calculate an average soil temperature by looking at the average air temperature over a 3-day period. And I'm not talking about average high, I'm talking about average altogether. And that will give you an estimate of your soil temperature. And so it's a good way to get a sense of whether or not things are warm enough. Some people will say that if you put things out too early, they stunt because the soil isn't warm enough, and then they just never kind of recover. And so planting things out early, unless you're giving them some additional protection, not always the best strategy. It's much better to know where your soil temperatures are at and wait until things have warmed up, especially if you're direct seeding. And so corn is a great example of that. And then, of course, putting out things like your tomatoes and your melons and your squash and your cucumbers, those can definitely all be somewhat stunted if the soil temperature hasn't warmed up enough. The same goes in the other direction, which is you can plant out things that are cool season crops like lettuce and broccoli and bok choy, and it's too warm if you wait too long, and the plants just immediately try to go to seed. So they send up a flower stalk and they do what's called bolting. And my favorite version of this is bok choy. It seems like the window for getting bok choy to get good sized before it starts to bolt is about 5 days. It's either too cold and it's not ready to be out, or it's too hot and it's just immediately going to try to go to seed. So soil temperature is really important for your cool season crops as well. If you get things out too late, they won't be great. Cucumbers get bitter when it's really hot. Lettuce gets bitter when it's really hot. And so knowing when your optimum soil temperatures are and paying attention to that can make all the difference. Let's imagine for a minute that you don't have a thermometer that you can stick in the ground and you don't have a website that you can look up the soil temperatures. How are you supposed to know where things are at? One of the ways you do that is something called phenology, which is looking at the plants around you that are there every year and noticing patterns. So for instance, we have a black locust that grows in our yard, in our driveway. It was here when we bought the property. And when that blooms, it's the perfect time to plant tomatoes. And that may vary year by year, depending on whether we've had a cool spring or a warm spring. But I know when I see that black locust blooming, it is time to put my tomatoes in the ground, that the soil temperature has gotten to where I want it to be. Looking at and getting to know your weeds and recognizing what comes up when can also be a great indicator. A good example is in the early spring, you see dandelions come up and start to bloom. I have speedwell around here, which is a little low-growing kind of creeping plant. That starts to bloom really early. We have purple dead nettle. Those are really early season plants. And then as the soil starts to warm up, I see the dreaded bindweed, and I know that my soil has reached a certain temperature because the bindweed is starting to come up. I'll see lamb's quarter, and I'll see red root pigweed, and I'll see purslane. Those are all summer varieties that don't germinate from seed or don't come back from perennials until the soil starts to warm up. And so getting to know your local weeds and recognizing what comes up when can be a really good indicator of what your soil is doing temperature-wise. So if you're just starting out and you're on a budget and you're trying to start seeds in, a sunny windowsill of your house, and let's say you keep your house fairly cool in order to save money, and your seeds just aren't coming up, a lot of times that might be the issue. My pepper seeds sitting on a heat mat in an 80-degree room, those pepper seeds will come up usually within 5 days. In a 68-degree room, 65-degree room, peppers can come up in sometimes weeks. It can take a very long time. And the longer it takes a seed to come up, the more likely it is to rot before it actually germinates. And so it can make a big difference where you put your seeds in terms of the heat of the house, and you can definitely slow things way down just by having your house be a little bit too cold. So as we get into full-on planting season, where we're starting to transplant out our seedlings into our garden, or we're direct seeding into our garden as the soil warms up, just keep in mind soil temperature is actually really, really important. And it's important that you pay attention to it, because sometimes if things aren't going well, it's simply because it's a little bit too cold and things aren't quite ready. Thanks for watching, Tribe. Stay tuned for part 2, 3, and 4 of this series, where I will talk about moisture, soil, and light, and the importance of those for growing your plants. In the meantime, thanks for watching. If you like this kind of content, give me a thumbs up, subscribe, leave me a comment, and share. I have new content coming out every week.